Hi there. My name is Madison Condon. I work primarily at the Columbia Water Center, and unlike most of my fellows, I am a lawyer by training. And I'm going to talk today about investor influence as cross-border environmental regulator, focusing on investor disclosure rules and whether or not that actually impacts corporate behavior. So one of the things I'm interested in is whether the rules here in the US that govern the information that companies are required to give their investors, whether or not that can actually influence the behavior of the companies abroad. Because usually, because of sovereignty and international law and many other issues, US law can't directly govern like many of the behaviors across borders. But disclosure is one route that could be possible. So my work at the Water Center focuses primarily on the mining industry, but this industry has this research has applications to like many other industries. The mining industry is interesting to focus on because typically the headquarters are in rich, developed countries and their operations are scattered across the world in resource-rich but otherwise developing countries. So with a focus on the mining industry, the mining industry is increasingly facing more and more water-related risks. There's more frequent incidents of drought, which leads to water scarcity, and flooding, which leads to operational shutdowns. Water demands are increasing as miners turn to processing poorer and poorer grades of ore as commodity prices rise. Many countries where the mining operations take place are strengthening their environmental legislation and also the enforcement of that legislation. And greater attention is being paid both domestically and internationally on the impact of the communities that live near the mine that compete for the same water sources. So investors want to know more about these risks, especially because these risks can affect the bottom line of the company that they are choosing to put their money in. So one route to understanding these risks and how the company is prepared to deal with them is through disclosure. And disclosure can be voluntary, and there are many voluntary initiatives out there. The Carbon Disclosure Project, which is now known as CDP, has a water disclosure project that they've been sort of increasing the scope of over the years. There's the Global Reporting Initiative, which is not mining industry specific. And then there's industry associations. The ICMM is the International Council of Mining and Metals, which is global, and then the Mining Association of Canada requires all of their member companies to participate in certain disclosure programs within Canada. And then there's also mandatory requirements. The US Securities and Exchange Commission requires disclosure for all countries that are listed on US stock exchanges. The Canadian, and which I'll talk more about later, and the Canadian securities is also regulated, also requires disclosure, but it's regulated at the provincial level. And then various local environmental laws require reporting of certain environmental factors. So yeah, this is just an example. It doesn't matter if you can't read it. It's just an example of these are all the various voluntary disclosure initiatives that apply just to the mining industry. So there's like a million out there. And that can have some downsides as well. It's like, which one do you pick and which one is actually valid? So what would you want out of a disclosure program? At first brush in the legal world, you think of materiality, and that materiality means what information an investor might want to know in order to make an informed decision about where to place her money. But there are other benefits to disclosure as well, and one is having corporate leaders display their good performance on environmental, social, and governance factors, and it can place pressure on industry laggers. And more data on water risk, both qualitative and quantitative, can also help to inform the communities that are being affected by the mining operations to advocate for more change through either protests or lobbying or lawsuits, media exposure, encouraging regulation, encouraging divestment. All of these changes can occur just through having more information disclosed through securities regulation. So, for all the reasons one might want disclosure, voluntary reporting systems have their drawbacks. One current critique of the Global Reporting Initiative, which is used by many mining companies, is that the mines often report their water risks at the company level rather than at the mine asset level. So it can be hard to understand exactly what's happening at a specific mine. And where water quantity issues are addressed or reported on, often water quality issues are totally ignored. And also, as we saw in the World Economic Forum slide, there's like a multitude of initiatives to choose from, so it's hard to know exactly which ones to trust. Companies can sort of cherry pick which ones like fit their own needs the best. And finally, they're voluntary, so while many of like the major mining companies that really care about their green PR, and they can have a separate office devoted to complying with these initiatives, the smaller companies, which can sometimes be the worst actors, can just opt out from participating in the programs. So mandatory disclosure can solve some of these issues. The Securities and Exchange Commission requires all publicly traded companies to publicly disclose material risks. So it should, in theory, include the water risks that I mentioned earlier, although in practice usually does not. In 2010, they issued a guidance about how to report on climate risk in particular. And in that guidance, it said the companies have to report significant physical effects of climate change, such as effects on the severity of weather, for example, as floods or hurricanes, sea levels, the arability of farmland, and water availability and quality. So they are technically required to report on a lot of these risks, though if you look, so this is a nonprofit series. They have this really great tool called the SEC Sustainability Disclosure Search, and you can refine by the type of risk you're interested in, the industry you're interested in, which exchange the companies have been listed on, and you can search for exactly what they've been reporting on. And it really varies from company to company and from industry to industry. So it's also not entirely clear what types of risks are required to be disclosed. And I'm just going to give a few examples of how SEC rules could have an effect in this industry. So in Chile, Barrick Gold invested in this project called Pasco Lama, which is, was to date, like the highest attempted giant mining operation, like the highest elevation, and was close to these massive glaciers, which are protected by many of Chile's national laws. So they had to go through all these hoops to get the approval process and to get their permits approved. But during construction, it became clear that there actually wasn't enough water available to undergo the proper dust control technologies and to actually like process the ore in the ways that they had agreed to under the water management plan approved by the Chilean government. But Barrick kept operating anyway and just didn't tell the Chilean government. They were eventually shut down, and in 2013, the courts levied a $16 million fine on Barrick. Their stocks took a nosedive over a series of months, even though they halted trading. And then just over, I think it was in March, Barrick reached a settlement with its shareholders that sued Barrick for not disclosing this risk, because Barrick all along had been telling its shareholders that it was totally in compliance and was able to meet all of the demands of the environmental regulations. Those shareholders that sued Barrick just reached a settlement of $140 million. So that's a sum that is significant enough to actually change the behavior of the companies, and these types of cases are on the rise. There's a Canadian shareholder suit against Barrick for the same incident, and that is still in the beginning stages. Around this time last year, there was, or I guess in November of last year, there was a giant mining disaster in Brazil where a tailings dam collapsed and wiped out a series of villages. I think about 16 people died, and that was a joint operation between the mining company Vale and BHP Billiton. And there are at least 3 different shareholder lawsuits against those 2 companies for alleged misstatements about warnings, ignoring warnings about the structural soundness of the tailings dam itself. And then there's also reports that maybe Vale and BHP had lied about the toxicity of the tailings as they reached their way towards the Atlantic Ocean. And the likelihood of a giant payout there is significant. One other bullet point is BP just agreed to pay its shareholders $175 million to settle not even just about the disaster itself, but about the misstatements of they made misstatements to their shareholders about the flow of the oil that was leaching into the Gulf of Mexico during only like a few days' time. But even during that time, the amount of BP stocks crashed. The investors were able to recover $175 million. And then one more point is earlier, just last month, ExxonMobil's shareholders filed a shareholder class action against Exxon, which is the largest publicly traded company in the world, alleging that they have failed to disclose the climate risks associated with their investments and that there's a bunch of stranded assets that Exxon will not be able to materialize on, and they've been lying to their investors over time. So that would be a really interesting development to see how that case goes. So the SEC is in the process of revising its reporting requirements for the mining industry in particular, and in industries across all companies across all industries. And obviously, under the new administration, these are less likely to be expansive with environmental risks. But it just seems that courts are actually recognizing that those kinds of investment risks are significantly material and are starting to enforce these kinds of class actions at a higher rate. So I'm a little bit out of time, but one of the questions also is, so there's also these voluntary reporting initiatives, and I just wanted to go through some of the data that we've tested. So one of the questions we had is, so for these voluntary reporting initiatives where they're not actually required by the government that's regulating the securities exchange, do they have an impact on behavior? So we looked at the Mining Associations of Canada's disclosure requirements, and we compared all the mines in Canada that operate and comply with these voluntary reporting requirements to see if they actually changed water quality downstream from the mine. And the short summary is that yes, as the mines participated in these disclosure programs, the water quality around the mines increased at a significant rate. So, the end.
So I will now take a few minutes for questions from the first three speakers, if the first three speakers would come to the front. And I have the first question. Where'd you go? Oh, yeah, thanks. So, Hannah, you might have said this, but 20% excess deaths is really large. That's far more than you get in like the European heat wave or any other heat waves, as far as I know. 20% is a lot. And did you say you do or you don't have cause of death data?
So it's not cause of death data, it's all-cause mortality. I mean, I'm not going to be able to get into the graphic details of the epidemiology because the regressions, but that's what Katrin worked on. But it's all-cause mortality data controlled for various long and short-term confounders like seasonality, external causes of death like natural disasters, not heat, and car crashes and things like that. So it's not attributed deaths, but actually you see that all around the world, that people sort of think, oh, we can't do these studies because we don't have data on specifically heat-related deaths, but actually the way that heat works is often, there is heat stroke, which is a direct effect, but often it affects people by exacerbating other conditions. So that's
do you know the age distribution of?
I don't, but Katrin did a whole PhD on it.
Oh.
So you could read that.
Yeah, it's mostly elderly people, right?
Yeah, I think she found, broadly speaking, that older men were the most vulnerable people, which is interesting because in Chicago and in Europe it was old women living alone. Whereas, I mean, this is one of the reasons why it's so interesting. It would be so interesting to be able to do these kinds of like more social science studies in there, because we really only have studies that are done in other regions of the world to go on. And there are many different things. The climate is different, but so is all of the social factors. You know, people live in different circumstances. They live in perhaps potentially more socially connected environments. Old people tend to live with their families rather than live alone. There are all these different things that could make it different from where it is elsewhere.
Yeah, it's old women living on their own on the top floor of 6th-floor walk-up buildings.
There you go, exactly.
Okay, other questions?
Okay. Yes, I have a follow-up on the heat waves, a question. So suppose you can predict, is there some evidence that these kinds of predictions have had an impact? Will people in Bangladesh be able to take some measures, avoid some activities? How do you picture that next step?
Yeah, so there is I think evaluation studies of heat early warning systems are few and far between, but a few have been done, and where they've been done, they've found that lives have been saved, including in Ahmedabad. I think there's a paper coming out about that one in India. So it is clear that there are things that can be done, and I think the main obstacle to achieving that in Bangladesh will be getting all of the different people and institutions lined up in place and ready to go when there is a warning trigger. The main, I mean, working with Bangladesh Met Department and doing the research on the forecasting is certainly a challenge, but I would say that it pales in comparison to the challenge of getting all of the other institutional capacity together. But there definitely are measures that you can take. Some of them are common sense as well. You know, for example, in Ahmedabad, they found that they noticed just through this study and a lot of public awareness that was part of this heat early warning system, they realised that babies in the neonatal ward were dying at a faster rate during heat waves, and that it was positioned on the top floor of the hospital, and they realised that the roof was covered in tar, and they moved the neonatal unit down to the ground floor, and lo and behold, no more baby deaths during heat waves. So there are those kinds of long-term measures that I think you don't even need forecast information for, but there's a lot of stuff that we could do, largely learning from the Ahmedabad experience. I mean, it's a great case study. So.
Thank you. A question from Ms. Nissan. Thank you. You talked about the soil moisture content, and you showed the rather dramatic falls before. Was it a high heat, or was it the end of months, just before monsoon season?
No, so that was showing the decrease in soil moisture as you run up towards a heat wave, which also happens to be before the monsoon season. Okay, so the second question is, soil moisture decrease is generally because of percolation and evaporation, and more because of pumping. Are you able to tell if those three numbers are more or less the same historically as they've always been, or is there something else going on? I haven't had any kind of look at human management of the land surface that could have something to do with that. However, I would suggest there's not necessarily, I can't think of immediately a reason why that would be worse, why that would show up in a heat wave effect. Physically speaking, we can understand the idea that soil moisture would be low in advance of heat waves, because when there's no water at the land surface, all of the energy goes into that would go into evaporation, instead goes into sensible heating, and it gets very hot. So it makes sense in that way. But I haven't yet picked it apart in terms of the different elements of the water budget.
I have a mining question. I happen to know that a famous smelter in Peru was kicked out of the local miners association because they were not doing something about the impact. I was wondering if you could tell us how these private initiatives to create these associations, how does one association gain more credibility than another? How does this build up?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very complicated question and process. Like, a lot of that just has to do with like social legitimacy, but also has to do with sort of peer-to-peer legitimacy. And yeah, when you have competing ones, it's hard for a consumer to tell the difference between like one association or the other, and that's a real problem. And that's why I think sort of like mandatory. So I am always skeptical of voluntary greenwashing initiatives, but they do. Some of them do in fact work.
This question is for Ruthie. Could you talk a little bit about the differences in how the antiretroviral and the methadone scale-up affected different demographics of the population in Ho Chi Minh City?
Hi, yes, thanks. So the methadone maintenance scale-up is basically only for injection drug users, which is, they're a specific small population in Ho Chi Minh City. The estimate is there are about 30,000 drug users in Ho Chi Minh City. And actually the prevalence of drug use ranges a lot across Vietnam. Also, about 90% of the drug users are men. So the numbers that we're using, I forgot to mention, are mostly for male injection drug users. So they do have, and what we've included in the model is there is a risk of HIV acquisition from sources other than injection drug use, because we assume that they interact with other parts of the population, for example, female sex workers. But most of the burden and most of the risk is for HIV acquisition is from injection drug use. And then in terms of acquiring or getting linked into antiretroviral therapy programs, a lot of the methadone maintenance programs require that you're on antiretroviral therapy if you're HIV positive in order to get enrolled in the program. So that's why we assume that there's a connection with adherence. Does that answer your question?
Okay, so thank you. We're going to begin with the next group of 4. There'll be a question period at the end of those talks, but you can ask these people questions then too if you happen to think of one between now and then.